Okay then. Now, we today have the honor of welcoming a man who knows more about stories than anyone else I can think of, and who recently also chose to share his knowledge in this book. So it's a great opportunity. Yorke is the managing director of Company Pictures, the UK drama independent producing Skins, Shameless, The White Queen, and Wolf Hall. For many years, he's been responsible for a vast array of British drama, but as both head of Channel 4 Drama and controller of BBC Drama Production. In 2005, he created the BBC Writers' Academy, a year-long in-depth training scheme which has produced a generation of successful television writers. He's also worked as editor of The Archers. He is currently a visiting professor of English language and literature at the University of Newcastle upon Tyne. So I would like for us all to give a round of applause as a welcome to Yorke.
Thank you so much for those generous words. I shall begin with a thank you and apology. Firstly, a thank you. I'm hugely flattered to be asked to come and talk here today. It means something very much to me. And secondly, apology, because what I'm going to try and do in the next 35, 40 minutes is tell the whole history and mechanics of how all storytelling has worked since the beginning of time. So if I rush through that slightly, please forgive me. I'm going to take loads of shortcuts, make loads of absurd generalizations, loads of things where you may go, but if you feel like going, then please do stop me and ask questions. It's absolutely fine. I'll try and leave some time at the end. But in the interest of brevity and moving on, what I'm going to talk about today is what I'm going to call story physics. I'm going to talk about how narrative works and explore the similarities between narrative in film and television, but also hopefully touch on theatre, novel, and narrative in life, about how we tell stories about the institutions we work in, about our history, and how perhaps, arguably, they all work in exactly the same way, and perhaps that has something to do with the laws of physics. Okay, so that's really what I want to do in a nutshell. So I want to begin with a quote from Andrew Stanton, who worked for Pixar, and some of you will know, directed the film Finding Nemo. And I came across this quote some years ago. He said, "You often hear the term, you should have something to say in a story, but that doesn't always mean a message. It means truth, some value that you yourself as a storyteller believe in. And then through the course of the story, be able to debate that truth, try to prove it wrong, test it to its limits. This is the stuff I really geek out on. I call this story physics." And story physics, that whole subject of something confronted by its opposite, is really the heart of what I want to talk about this afternoon. Okay, now, I want to begin with a clip, if I may. The first clip, it's from EastEnders, which some of you may be familiar with, from about 20 years ago, which ages me because I was the script editor on this very clip. I suspect half of you probably weren't even born or not allowed by your parents to watch it. But should we have a quick look? It's about 2 minutes long. Hopefully it's self-explanatory.
Do you fancy me?
I've got enough problems without that, Bianca. Oh, come on, don't look at me like that.
Just keep making such a stupid fool out of myself.
No, you don't. It's all right, I understand, don't worry.
I'm embarrassed now.
Look, don't cry. There's no need to be embarrassed. It's only me, I'm not going to say nothing.
I feel really stupid.
Come here. Oh, you're a silly little thing, aren't you? Hey? Oh. Shall I sing you a lullaby?
No. Kiss me.
There. I do. Feel better now?
No, kiss me properly.
No, I don't think that's such a good idea, Bianca.
Why not?
Look, Bianca, you're drunk. You don't know what you're doing.
Well, don't you like me?
Yes, I do. I like you a lot. Don't do that, eh? Don't do that. Bianca, stop it. Look, just...
I like you too.
Stop it. This is something you will regret now. Just stop it.
No, it ain't.
Bianca, cut it out, will you? Just cut it out. I'm sorry, but this ain't on. Do you know what I mean?
No, I don't as it goes.
It's nothing personal.
That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard you say.
Yeah, you're right, it is.
But then why not? I mean, what's wrong with me? Why does no one like me?
I do like you. I like you very much.
Well, then why did
We just can't. Okay, we can't.
But I want you, Dave.
No, you don't, Bianca. Look, really, you don't. Believe me. Look, you've been drinking, darling. You don't know what you're doing, let alone what you want.
I do. I want you. And you want me as well, didn't you?
Bianca, please don't do this to me. Bianca, stop it! Stop it! For crying out loud, you're trying to drive me insane. Bianca, you can only push a bloke so far. Do you know what I mean?
Well, why? What have I done?
You know what you did.
I don't. Why not? I mean, what's your problem?
I'm your father, all right?
No, you ain't. You can't be.
I can be. And I am. I'm sorry. I'm really, really sorry. You shouldn't have found out like this. Yeah. Come on.
Don't touch me. Just leave me alone.
I'm not sure you're supposed to laugh quite that much, but it's fine. It's rather dated, and it is what it is. But what I want to use it to is to illustrate a sort of, hopefully a deeper point. For years, I set up the BBC Writers Academy, and my job has been to teach people storytelling. And I developed this ridiculously shorthand, ridiculously simplistic way of trying to analyse how a story works if you get stuck. And I came up with a system in which if you ask 10 questions and you can answer them all, probably that will give you a story shape. And those 10 questions were very quickly, whose story is it? What's the flaw in their character? What's the inciting incident? What do they want? What obstacles are in their way? What's at stake? Why should we care? What do they learn? How and why do they change? And how does it end? Okay, so very simple, again, simplistic for obvious reasons for brevity. But you take those 10 questions, let's have a look at that scene we've just seen, because it applies to whole stories, it applies to episodes of stories, but it also applies to scenes themselves, because dramatic structure is fractal, so it's the same units enlarged time and time again. So if we take David's story, and again, simplistic answers, whose story is it? Well, it's David's, obviously. What's his flaw? Well, he has a knowledge that he hasn't imparted, which is, I'm your father, obviously. This was before Star Wars, I'd like to make this quite clear. What's the inciting incident? What's the event that sparks off the problem, the catalyst? Bianca tries to kiss him. What does he want? Well, he wants to stop her kissing him. Sort of. What obstacles are in his way? Well, obviously Bianca. It's very simple. And then we move over. What's at stake? Well, his mental state, I think we can probably say. A few laws, perhaps, as well. Why should we care? Well, hopefully we like the character. Not like, but there's something about him that we care about. He's vulnerable. We empathise with him. What does he learn? He learns to tell the truth. How and why? Bianca pushes him to the point of no return. Sexual arousal, etc. Because at some level, clearly, there's something going on that he's very uncomfortable with. How does it end? The knowledge is imparted. Okay, so very simplistic, but it will do as a kind of rule of thumb. But let's have a look at Bianca and what Bianca does. Because what if it's Bianca's story? And what you get is, whose story is it? Well, obviously it's Bianca's. What's her flaw? Well, it's her lack of knowledge of the situation. It's her innocence. What's the inciting incident? He rejects her. She wants to sleep with him. What obstacles are in their way? Well, David and David's behaviour. What's at stake? Her mental state. Why should we care? Arguably, she's vulnerable. 2, what does she learn? She's going to learn to deny the truth. How and why David pushes her to the point of no return. How does it end? Truth rejected. No, you ain't. Get away from me. Okay. So it's, again, very simple. I brought it right down to absolute basics. But clearly there's a pattern going on. And what this pattern, I think, introduces to, which is really at the heart of the physics, and the physics that underpins story I want to talk today, is about this extraordinary universe of opposites. Okay. So here's the pitch document for The Wire, which David Simon wrote and sent to HBO. And in the pitch document, he says, suddenly the police bureaucracy is amoral, dysfunctional, and criminality in the form of the drug culture is just as suddenly a bureaucracy. All of The Wire, all of 5 series of The Wire are built on exactly the same engine. It's 2 sides slowly changing places over 5 seasons. What I'm going to answer, hopefully by the end of this, I'll have gone somewhere to convince you that opposites are the root of everything. And you can see this, I think, quite clearly by just looking at any drama you've seen in the last week, the last month, any book you've read, any image you find. Opposites. Opposites again. Sorry, that's a very bad quality image. That is a shark, and apparently I once looked a bit like him as well. But, anyway, so there you go. So opposites again, complete opposites. So on a story level, if you take, I just plucked these at random this morning, every character is thrown into a world which is absolutely opposite of the world they start in. Not just vaguely opposite, but absolutely opposite. So Avatar, Captured by Natives, James Bond, Goldfinger, classic opposites. The Queen has no empathy. Diana dies. She's thrown into a world where she has to feel. The King's Speech, classic opposite, mad Australian, in his view, I should add. 127 Hours, a man who believes in absolutely freedom running through the wilderness. Trapped, The Social Network, Jewish, insecure geek thrown into big wasp world of unimaginable privilege. 12 Years a Slave, of course, is absolutely built on the dialectic of freedom and slavery. Rush, Nicky Hunt and Lauder, obvious its opposites. Gravity, companionship, solitude. Okay, they're all very clearly embrace these 2 states and are about the transition from one state into another. On a scene level, for those of you old enough, on EastEnders, probably the biggest moment in EastEnders history, or one of them, you can't tell me what to do, you ain't my mother. Cat, yes I am. Okay, it's very simple. They're absolutely opposite in every conceivable way. And then if you go to British television, if you go back in the history, that's about 30 years old now, Edge of Darkness, Bob Peck, his daughter's been murdered. He goes and looks in her bedroom because he can't understand what's happened, and he finds a teddy bear and he finds a gun. And the whole of the series is about how does that make sense? And in the end, he finds out why and how. Line of Duty, apologies for the image, but again, very clear opposites in those 2 characters. That's series 1 of Line of Duty. Forgive, these are largely BBC and British examples, so forgive me. Line of Duty, series 2, those 2 very clear emotionally opposites. And if you go back again to one of the great shows of British television, a man with terrible psoriasis lying in a hospital bed, fantasizing of being the coolest detective this side of Humphrey Bogart in the 1930s. He fantasizes the opposite state for himself. And then we get to sidekicks. I mean, this could go on for a long time, but clearly they're built on something more than just, oh, that's interesting, says the writer, I'll do that. And they always, if you go back as far, this is Callan, which is 1973, I believe. I'm going back as far as I could in television terms. What you start to realise that story physics, this whole thing of opposites, is everywhere. So why? What is going on? It doesn't make sense. So, any of you who've studied screenwriting at all or have a vague or passing interest in screenwriting may have heard of this guy, Sid Field, who in the 1970s wrote this book. And Sid Field was the first person to try and articulate how storytelling worked in Hollywood. And he basically came up with an archetype, a paradigm with 3 acts. He certainly wasn't the first person to notice it, but he was the first person to write it down, articulate it, and use it as a teaching tool, which allowed him to create an industry which has grown insanely to the level of today, where screenwriting teaching is one of the biggest industries outside of cinema making itself. So he created a simple paradigm. There's a 3-act structure: setup, confrontation, and resolution. That would be interesting. And between each stage, a turning point at the end of each act. So Act 1, setup; Act 2, confrontation; Act 3, resolution. Okay. Now, this carried on for 20 years, and there were thousands more books, notably by people like Christopher Vogler and Robert McKee in 2000. And they all largely stick to the adherence to the 3-act form. But what's interesting about all these books is none of them say why. There is no articulation of why. They say you must have an inciting incident on page 12, but they don't tell you what font size you're writing in. So it can't make any sense. It doesn't have any intellectual rigor. And it seems to me that the most important thing about studying narrative is if you say these things, you have to prove them. You know, it's basic science. You have to approach it like science. Okay. But 1 or 2 people did make a breakthrough. There was a man called Lajos Egri, who was a Hungarian theatre critic in the 1960s, and then later the American playwright David Mamet started to realize that there was a pattern, and it was a pattern that is effectively based on the act of perception. Okay, so how do we perceive the world? There's a babe, forgive the graphics, snatched, slightly random. There's a baby, and there's a match. If the baby touches the match, the baby learns not to touch the match again, isn't it? It's very simple. It's, I exist, I perceive the world, I change. You come to this talk today, you listen to me, and you decide what you think of me and what I'm saying. And now that can be fine. You know, you may think I talk rubbish, I may think I don't. That's absolutely fine, but the process will happen whether you like it or not. You can't help but come to some conclusion about what you perceive. You know, I'm sure you do this, of course you do this in your jobs every day. Okay, so fundamentally, what we're saying is we think dialectically. Thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. So it's all built around Hegel's theory of dialectics, although it goes back much further than that. So the fundamental process by which humans assimilate knowledge, we exist, we find something new, we explore it, and we assimilate it, and we change. And of course, what we're doing because of that is we're ordering the world. We're turning the world into narrative, because the world without order is overwhelming and scary and unimaginable and terrifying and makes no sense. So we tell ourselves stories to make it safe. And you know, there is no better example of the company we sit in today in ordering, sifting, making sense of the world in an extraordinary way. So every act of perception, therefore, is an attempt to impose order. So every time we come across alien phenomena, we explore it, we find its essential truth, and then we assimilate it. So we test it, hopefully scientifically, but often with the prejudices we've already learned. We just bring those to bear and change again. In that process changes us. Okay. So fundamentally, storytelling, therefore, is a manifestation of this process. There's 3 acts. There don't have to be 3 acts, and I'll come back to that later. But fundamentally, each stage is an act. Something confronted by its opposite learns and assimilates and changes. So typically in Hollywood, what you see is a character with a flaw. And in the second act, you confront them with their absolute opposite. So King George VI, Lionel Logue, learns not to stutter. And it sounds simplistic, doesn't it? But fundamentally, that's sort of how structure works. So you take any Pixar film, I picked 3 at random. Obviously, you have Woody in the first Toy Story, benevolent dictator controlling, thrown out of the window into a world he can't control, has to make friends and learn to ask other people their opinion, gets back home. Finding Nemo, again, Tom Hanks controlling father, child disappears, thrown into chaos, learns to allow the child to play. Cars, Lightning McQueen, arrogant, bratish sports car, lost in the middle of a small American town, learns the values of friendship, love, and that you don't have to drive very fast everywhere. I mean, it's very simplistic, but of course, when it's done well, it's very affecting as well. So I picked those at random because they're very good examples of good commercial properties, but you will find this in art house movies absolutely as well. But fundamentally, what we're saying is that Hollywood archetype is dialectics in its most simplified form. So Act 1, you establish a character. Act 2, you confront it with their opposite. And Act 3, you synthesize the two to achieve balance. And yet again, if you want to talk about art house books, you take something like the film David Hare adapted of the book of the Bernard Schlink book, The Reader, and you have a young boy who falls in love with a woman who's older than him. She suddenly disappears. Years later, she discovers she's been arrested for being a Nazi camp guard. And in the third act, he condemns her utterly. And in the third act, when he starts to understand why and what happened to her, he starts to forgive her. So the same shape resolves itself again and again. It's not just in Pixar films. And so something that was going on long before someone came along and codified it has been going on since the beginning of time, because, of course, you see the very same pattern in Antigone. It's Antigone and Creon. They're opposites, aren't they? You see it in Socratic dialogue. It's all built on opposites, like I'm sure an awful lot of what you do, built on opposites as well. So it forms the basic structural model, not just of every feature film, but what I would argue is all narrative as well. So storytelling becomes a codification of the essential method by which we learn, expressed in a 3-act dramatic shape. Okay, so if you're drawing the Hollywood paradigm, that's what it looks like, fundamentally. What you also notice is the symmetry in this, and you find this in inverted commas, perfectly structured films. Act 2, handily divided straight down the middle there, is double the length of the first and last act. There's something about human beings' attraction to symmetry when they create narrative that becomes very attractive. But also, if you're doing difficult narrative, you can bust that symmetry up and you create dissonance, which has its own effects as well. Okay, so the closer you look, the more these rules apply. But there's one area in particular that I sort of wanted to dwell on to show how deep this goes, because I think it's probably the most unseen area of all, and that is the area of character and characterization. Okay, so there we go. Some of you may recognize this chap. He was head of the co-op, Paul Flowers. He was a Methodist minister, highly respected member of the establishment, and then the Daily Mail, with typical male gusto, exposed him as a man hiring rent boys and buying crack with them, and had collapse of career, shame, etc., etc. Same person, obviously. It's a common trope. So really what I want to talk about before I come back to narrative is a bit about us as people and how we work as people. So there's a contradiction, isn't there, at the heart of our being. You'll see this in the search engines you use, which reveal sides about people that they would never admit to publicly. That's fundamentally the contradiction. We are all animals, yet unlike animals, we are all capable of rationality. So we all have our own survival at heart, yet we have to live in a society where we have to repress some of our survival instincts to survive and live with other people. So we all have a fundamental biological urge to replicate our genetic material, yet we cannot always express that because, the worst case scenario is you end up in court. You have to control your urges to live in society, and most people manage that very successfully. But they probably, some may go online instead and express them that way. So you look at the behaviour on internet forums, and I probably had The Guardian more in mind than anyone else here, but when societal restrictions are removed, the absence of identity allows the inner animal off the leash. So, there is nothing more enlightening, I think, than the forums of a liberal newspaper, because the comments underneath are largely grotesque and offensive and deeply just horrible, basically. They're probably the same on every newspaper, but there's something that speaks more about that kind of newspaper, which I read myself. But I think it's no accident that these websites are home to offensive material, because when you strip away the need for exterior, when you strip away the need for identity, and of course you do this all the time in what do, you let loose the true feelings of impotence and anger and rage that can lurk underneath a caring exterior. Okay, so publicly, again, familiar, I'm sure, we tend to present ourselves as models of civic virtue. So in France, after the war, it was almost impossible to find anyone who said they supported the Vichy regime. And after Mandela was freed from jail in South Africa, no one ever voted nationalist. Understandably, because if you admitted to those things, you'd be in trouble. And it would be uncomfortable. So you had to perversely be brave to admit to those things, and it's hard. So the darker feelings, the rage or shame that fills those websites and our innermost thoughts when we're rejected, when we're angry, when we're not given the job we want, when we're humiliated, are hard to show publicly. Which is why at its most extreme, you end up with gun rage in America. So this conflict between what we really think and how we want to be perceived fuels every second of our waking lives. If you think of the first time you meet your group of people you work with, you think about what you're going to wear that morning, you think about what you're going to talk about that will make you feel them like you, hopefully, or not like you, if not liking is your goal. But fundamentally, you're creating an image about yourself that you want to be perceived publicly. And obviously that's the wellspring of the whole guilty pleasures phenomena, when you actually gleefully let that whole thing go and realise, it's okay to make a tit of yourself occasionally. What is Facebook for an advert for what it's actually seen? Again, I'm sure this will be familiar. Or as my friend said, what are the unwatched programs on your Sky Plus but taunting reminders of who we might really like to be? You tend, by default, to watch the ones that are the easiest ones to watch, unless you're a particular kind of person. So, detour back to where I was. How does this inform characterization, and how does this form narrative, and how does this inform opposites? But I think the interesting thing about storytelling, going back to its very beginning, is just the prevalence of paradoxical characters. Many in history and in literature, forgive me, many of whom sought fame or glory to still the conflict within. So from real life, I just chose a number of options at real life. So here we are. So we have an insightful liberal, champion of the underdog, author of Huckleberry Finn and Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's court, one of the most enlightened men of American letters, but also champion of free market capitalism, overt racist, and declared Philistine. Of course, it's Mark Twain. It was Mark Twain and Samuel Clemens, and that's always a telltale sign when they have two names. But, extraordinary character, wonderful writer, complicated. Let's take another one. Socialist, religious, campaign for rights of the individual, championed free market economic policy, invaded Iraq, removed countless democratic freedoms. Where am I going with that? There's endless fascinating paradoxes in that character. Appearance, champion of the underdog, perfect marriage, athletic alpha male, reality, scion of privilege, serial philanderer, crippled with Addison's disease. Kennedy, obviously, isn't it? An extraordinary character as well. The richness of these characters is always incredibly striking. But what's interesting is the war that's going on between their public and private selves continually. But what's interesting too is how this applies to fictional characters. you see this with big dramatic tropes. If you make soap opera for any length of time, you see these things again. The trope of the vicar revealed as the child abuser, the preacher who's the love rat, the union leader who's the demagogue. They come across my desk about once a month in stories pitched to me. And you see it all the time if you look at the great characters of fiction on television. So, a man of substance, well-versed in the finer things of life, a man who prides himself in his aptitude for service, a man who hates the working class. He's a henpecked husband running a cheap B&B in Torquay, isn't he? It's very simple, isn't it? But that's where the drama comes from. That's where the story comes from. A soldier, successful public figure, model of respectability, in reality, a figure of fun, provincial bank manager, hopeless marriage, is Captain Marrying again, and his absolute opposite is, of course, Sergeant Wilson. Appearance. Rich, sophisticated playboy, in charge of everything he surveys, a man who has everything. Dirt poor white trash, lost soul, a man who has nothing, not even his name, because he's not even Don Draper at all. And you could do the same with Tony Soprano. You can do it the same with most characters. So in real life and in fiction, and of course us too, if we're honest, conflict is at the heart of our character. And it's the conflict between the facade a character chooses to project and their deeper internal vulnerabilities, between the mask they adopt to be a socially acceptable member of society and the inner feelings of vulnerability that lie underneath. But what's interesting about this is how it resolves itself in dramatic structure and narrative structure, and how narrative structure works, because there's a pattern. So here's a story, there's a story arc, so from beginning to end, there's our narrative. A character starts off as Don Draper or Tony Soprano, and he goes on a journey, his facade over time slips away to reveal the hidden person underneath, and the inner person hidden away at the start obviously rises to the fore, okay? And something very interesting happens in exactly the middle of the story. King Lear would be a very good example. Starts as king, exactly halfway through, naked in a hovel in the storm on the heath. I shall come back to that. So we call that the midpoint of any story. So hence the look that most characters have in a quintessential dilemma in the middle of any narrative. Let's have a look at a clip of how that works in probably one of the most famous examples of all. Can we have the Godfather clip? This is exactly halfway through the first Godfather movie.
Senti me? Nicolozzo, tu mi capisci, no? Sei italiano come tuo padre? Tuo padre sta male. Quando tu sta meglio. Il cambio ti fa un giù, ognuno. E mettiamo tutto a posto. Steve sta lì, si deve finire.
So, it is what it is. Exactly halfway through the story, the old self and the new self meet, battle, and change sides. So if the law-abiding soldier learns his father has been shot, if you break the Godfather into 5 acts, saves his father in hospital, learns he's not scared of working in that world, kills Solozzo and McCluskey, we've just seen, sacks Tom Hagen, makes his father his consigliere, kills everyone. It's really simple, it's a bit simplistic, but fundamentally, bang in the middle, war hero, it's a good thing. But what's even more bizarre, if you're as sad as I am and you sit there with a stopwatch and you work these things out, what you get at regular 20-minute intervals, excuse the slightly jumpy graphics, is you get that. If you break it into Shakespearean 5-act structure, you get a very, very clear physical pattern of how it works. And I don't believe for a second Francis Ford Coppola thought about that. He just did it. Because exactly the same pattern exists in Macbeth, which is to all intents and purposes the same story. The modest soldier hears the witch's prophecy, angst ridden and pushed by Lady Macbeth, he kills Duncan, he murders Banquo, Fleance escapes, Macduff defects, murders Lady Macduff and her children, is abandoned by all, Lady Macbeth goes mad around there, believes himself invincible, I cannot be killed, it's a tragedy, so he's killed. So he goes from modesty, he's talked about as being modest at the first, to absolute arrogance at the end. So from war hero into monster, and very clearly each Shakespearean act at that point, you see that physical change. So, sorry, that was a bit of a quick, there we go. So from there to there, just the parallels are endless. Again, I secretly love Legally Blonde, I think it's rather marvellous, but as it starts, Elle, our Reese Witherspoon character, is all pink with a loud hairdo. So that's how she starts. Let's have a look at that again. 96 minutes later, her hair is immaculate, and there's a small splash of pink on her collar. And exactly halfway through, she gains entry into the law firm. Exactly halfway through. I don't think they planned that either. But what you're seeing is this extraordinary thing about character design, about how two opposites meet and undergo a reaction dictated, we think, by the artistic muse, but actually by the laws of physics and then digested through the laws of biology. So if it's a book, we can read it over time. In cinema, it'll be an hour and a half. In theatre, there'll be act breaks for us allowed to go to the toilet, and in previous times, to allow for daylight and standing, etc. So Andrew Stanton, who we started with at the beginning, in the same lecture he was talking about then, he said, good storytelling never gives you 4, it gives you 2 plus 2. If you construct your story correctly, it compels the audience to conclude the answer is 4. This works at every aspect of filmmaking, down to a molecular level, editing, plot lines, relationships. And I think it's true of every kind of narrative, and certainly of PR, is if you tell someone what to think, they won't think it. But if you allow them to work it out, obviously, they'll do it themselves. And if you tell a story in which that message is embodied, obviously that will have extraordinary power. But at every level, down to a molecular level, you see this universal theory of 2 plus 2. So it's David and Bianca once again. And if you look at that David and Bianca scene, you'll see that pattern. As Bianca learns the truth, follows exactly the same plan again. It's actually it's a law of physics. Okay, so all character, all structure, all drama is built on the war between opposites. And again, how long have we got? Every Shakespeare play is absolutely archetypal. Think of what you watched last week. You'll find exactly the same pattern going on. There's some more Shakespeare, back to EastEnders, forgive me, Tony Strapano and Jennifer Melfi, NYPD Blue, Steptoe and Son. Obviously, sitcoms are a classic, very clear example, Hancock and Sid James. Go back to It Ain't Half Hot Mum, again, Pixar, Homeland, Starsky and Hutch, Criminal Justice, Appropriate Adult, Downton Abbey, The Line of Duty, or The Village, or BBC One recently. Okay. Well, fundamentally, actually, so you go, well, why? Well, the answer is probably really simple and staring us in the face. It's that, isn't it? It's Newton's third law, which is when one body exerts force on a second body, the second body simultaneously exerts a force equal in magnitude and opposite in the direction of the first body. And so if you're starting at one place and you know you've got to end and home again, it will tend to follow that pattern. Now, obviously there are exceptions, because great filmmakers, just like great jazz musicians, will come and smash that up. But when they smash it up, they create a dissonance that you only know is dissonance because of its relevance to the shape itself. So that shape somehow has an extraordinary, that desire for symmetry seems to have an extraordinary pull on us. So years ago, when I started writing this book, I came across this quote from Hilary Mantel, who I'm sure you know, who wrote Wolf Hall. She was writing a book about the introduction of fairy tales. And just to wrap up, she said this. She said, the journey into the wood. She noticed that this story exerted itself and recurred again and again. The journey into the wood is part of the journey of the psyche from birth through death to rebirth. Hansel and Gretel, the woodcutter's children, are familiar with the wood's verges, but not its heart. Snow White is abandoned in the forest. What happens to us in the depths of the wood? Civilization and its discontents give way to the irrational and half-seen. Back in the village with our soured relationships, we are neurotic, but the wood releases our full-blown madness. Birds and animals talk to us, departed souls speak. The tiny rushlight of the cottages is only a fading memory. Lost in the extinguishing darkness, we cannot see our hand before our face. We lose all sense of our body's boundaries. We melt into the trees, into the bark and the sap, and from this green blood, we draw new life and are healed. That's Hilary Mantel on fairy tales, but what she's describing, of course, is that, the classic opposite. You start at home, you go on a journey into the heart of the woods where you find the opposite. It's exactly what Al Pacino does, exactly what King Lear does, exactly what King Macbeth does, and then you bring it home and you've changed. It's thesis, antithesis, synthesis again. Okay, that's the book, by the way. But I think before I do that, let me just go back to that a second. It's worth saying, obviously I've talked about narrative a lot today, but I think what's also fascinating, and probably a session for another time, is how this applies politically. Obviously all governments are interested in establishing a narrative, all political parties in opposition are interested in establishing a counter-narrative. It's all about, this is the narrative, I write the story, I'm the winning side. What's fascinating is how in life, from the Israel-Palestinian conflict to North and South Korea to Sunni and Shia that we see today, what we do is we create those opposites again. And if you look at how those various sects divide themselves, you see the same pattern emerging. So we process real life for better, largely through fiction, but also with caution at the same time as well, which I think brings me exactly to 3 o'clock. So I shall stop there, but thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for that. It was fascinating. We don't have time for Q&A now because we have a thing we have to do. But I'm going to send a question that you can answer if you want to via email later, and that is, what Shakespearean drama do you think Google is in? I would love to know that. And I hope it's a good one. So with that said, thank you for a fascinating lecture, and thanks for coming out to us.
Thank you very much.